Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the 13th and concluding segment in a series of programs I've been doing on human nature and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, religion, and science have said about it. In this program, I'll attempt to bring together some of the strands of thought I've developed in the previous 12 segments. If I had only 15 to 20 minutes to tell someone what the great thinkers have said about human nature, what would I tell him or her? Well, I'd begin with the question, why bother to study human nature? Well, there is a consensus among the great thinkers that ignorance of one's nature is a chief cause of unhappiness. You remember the Greek maxim, know thyself. The idea is that to understand one's own nature, one must understand human nature. The famous thinkers also agree that a greater understanding of human nature gives us the potential to experience more fulfilling relationships, so that if we have a better handle on what constitutes human nature, that can facilitate our attempts to improve our marriages, friendships, and also raising children. The Buddha, in talking about the importance of learning about human nature, said that he believed that if one could come to a greater understanding of human nature, that could work to reduce one's suffering in life. Indeed, the Buddha said of himself that he worked to investigate human nature, to learn about human nature, and that the idea is that one must get to know human nature as intimately as an equestrian gets to know the horse he or she is training. Well, what is human nature? Which characteristics, specifically mental, emotional, psychological, seem to be common among human beings? In other words, which characteristics are typical of most, if not all, human beings? Well, I mentioned in one of the earlier segments that there is a consensus among the great thinkers that perhaps the two chief characteristics of us human beings are desire and fear. We are desirous creatures. For example, most of us desire pleasure, among many other things. And we are fearful creatures. For example, many, if not most people, fear not being approved of by other people. And of course, there are countless other fears, which I enumerated in a previous segment. The great thinkers have said we are also very complicated creatures. The Russian novelist Tolstoy addressed himself to this issue. He said that there is a tendency among human beings to attribute some leading quality to every person, to say of someone that the person is wise or unwise, energetic or lazy, kind or unkind. Tolstoy says, or said, this is an incorrect way of evaluating people. For this reason, Tolstoy said that we are so complicated that each of us at one time or another acts both wisely and unwisely, energetically and in a lazy way, and kindly and unkindly. Freud, in talking about how complicated we are, stressed our ambivalence. Freud said, it's not unusual that we human beings can love and hate the same person. And Pascal, the famous mathematician and devout Catholic, talked about how morally complicated we are. Pascal said that there are two natures in us. There are two natures in us, the one good, the other bad. Also, the famous thinkers have commented on our inclination to mask wearing. Schopenhauer said, we all wear a mask and play a role. And the actor Marlon Brando, in commenting on acting as a craft, said this. Brando said, acting is the least mysterious of crafts. Most people do it all day long. It's also been commented on by the great thinkers that we human beings tend to be aggressive creatures. Indeed, many of the famous thinkers believed that we have an instinct for aggression. Freud said this: the greatest hindrance to civilization is the innate inclination among human beings to be aggressive towards their fellow human beings. Scientist Carl Sagan, on this subject of human aggressiveness, put it this way. He talked about the reptilian core in human nature, which he defined as the kernel of savagery in the brain left untouched by the process of evolution. It is interesting that while we may have an instinct for aggression, so many of the great thinkers have claimed we are so complicated, we may also have an instinct for compassion. Indeed, while we may be aggressive creatures, or at least potentially aggressive creatures, we are also capable of compassion, love, and goodness. And now for an important scientific question, which again I alluded to and provided some background on in a previous segment. And now, by way of review, let me touch on it again. A very important scientific question is, what role do our genes and environment play in shaping human nature? Of course, this has to do with the long-lasting debate concerning nature versus nurture. And I mentioned some of the leading characters in this debate, people who over the centuries have given their opinions on whether it's basically our genes, our nature, inner nature, that determines how we behave, or whether it's our environment. St. Augustine claimed that we are born with a strong tendency towards evil. Again, St. Augustine believed it was more nature than nurture that was responsible for human beings having what he believed to be a strong tendency towards evil. Several centuries before St. Augustine, a very famous Chinese philosopher, Mencius, disagreed with Augustine's take on human nature. Mencius believed that human beings by nature are good. He believed that if human beings become bad, it's because of the adverse circumstances of their environment. For example, Mencius believed that if people are living in an unjust social order, in an unjust society, that society can corrupt people. But again, there is a difference. Augustine claiming that when babies come out of the womb, they have a tendency towards evil. Mencius, the Chinese philosopher, saying, no, they don't. That babies are basically good, and again, they can be corrupted by society. Let's fast forward now to the 19th and 20th centuries. Philosopher Herbert Spencer in the 19th century preached what has become known as social Darwinism. Spencer claimed that successful people tend to have superior inborn traits. Spencer believed that, generally speaking, very successful people are genetically superior to other people. Let's move into the 20th century now. Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner, perhaps the most famous psychologist ever to teach at Harvard, disagreed with Spencer. Skinner believed it's all about environment. And allow me to quote psychologist B.F. Skinner. He said, "Men are made, good or bad, wise or foolish, by the environment in which they live." Well, let's bring this debate into the 21st century. Where does the debate now stand? Well, we know that in recent years, there has been much research on the human genome. And there are heavyweight thinkers on both sides of the issue. There are heavyweight thinkers who emphasize genes as being the most important factor in determining human nature, while others emphasize environment. Among those emphasizing genes are Harvard professor E.O. Wilson and MIT professor Steven Pinker. They believe the brain is predisposed to favor certain behaviors. In other words, we are born with certain inclinations. And among the inclinations, biologist E.O. Wilson believes we are born with are a predisposition to status seeking, territorial expansion, and altruism. Again, Wilson confirming what so many thinkers have said, that we are so complicated. We may have a predisposition to both status seeking and altruism. MIT professor Steven Pinker is not quite as optimistic about E.O. Wilson concerning our genes and how they affect us. Pinker believes that our genes incline us to wish to dominate other people, and that our genes, in some way or another, dispose us to a willingness to use violence to get our way. Pinker also believes that our genes dispose us to ethnocentrism, that our genes dispose us to believe our group is better than other groups, and that our genes dispose us to group against group hostility. He believes that given our genetic makeup, it's not difficult to arouse ethnic and racial hatreds. Perhaps what is going on in Iraq today between the Sunnis and Shiites is some confirmation of what MIT professor Steven Pinker says. Among the heavyweight thinkers on the other side of the debate, heavyweight thinkers who emphasize environment as being the primary determinant of human nature are a former Harvard professor, the late Stephen Jay Gould, and also University of Pennsylvania professor Arthur Caplan. Gould, in trying to prove his point, talks about Lincoln's second inaugural address. And Abraham Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, appealed to the better angels of our nature. That's Lincoln's expression, the better angels of our nature. Gould said that you won't find that trait resident, for example, on gene 26, chromosome 12. Again, Gould claiming that the better angels of our nature have more to do with environment than genes. Arthur Caplan, University of Pennsylvania professor, who is the director of the Center for Bioethics at the University of Pennsylvania, has said this, and I'm quoting Professor Caplan: "Our genes are not the defining essence of who we are. Our genes can produce a wide array of outcomes depending on the environment in which they are activated." Science writer Erica Gould provides some common ground. She says the nature versus nurture debate is in some ways false because people on both sides of the debate concede that both genes and environment both contribute to shaping human nature. She says the question is the relative balance of culture versus genes in determining human nature. Professor Gene Robinson, who teaches at the University of Illinois, and indeed is the director of the neuroscience program at the University of Illinois, emphasizes how genes interact with the environment. He talks about animal studies, specifically animal studies done on rat pups. And Professor Robinson says this, and I'm quoting him: "Rat pups that are poorly cared for by their mother or mothers show profound changes in brain gene activity, and these rats who have been poorly raised by their mothers prove to be bad mothers themselves." There is, of course, a wide range of behavior among human beings. At one end of the spectrum are the St. Francis of Assisi's, the Albert Schweitzers, the Mother Teresas, the Gandhis. At the other end of the spectrum, the Hitlers, Stalins, Saddam Husseins, and the very dishonest people we come across in all walks of life. Socrates put it this way. He said, and I'm quoting Socrates, "The very good and the very bad are few. Most are betwixt and between." But I must tell you, there is a consensus among the famous thinkers that there is a dark side to human nature. Again, there is a consensus among the great thinkers that unfortunately there is a dark side to human nature. Psychiatrist Carl Jung talked about the shadow. He said, and I'm quoting him, "By shadow, I mean the negative side of the personality, the sum of those unpleasant qualities we tend to hide from other human beings." Jung, as well as Freud and Tolstoy, claimed that we human beings are deniers, we are repressors. We prefer to focus on other people's evil and not on our own. St. Augustine claimed we are all sinners. Well, what can be done to get human beings to treat each other more decently? I mentioned in a previous segment in which I talked about this at length. Remember now, I'm just providing a quick overview of this, that education and religion can play a part in improving human behavior. Both education and religion can promote introspection among human beings, self-examination, examination of one's conscience. Also, religion, for better or worse, can instill in people a fear of God, and some people claim that's good. The French intellectual Voltaire said if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. He believed it was very important that people have a fear of God and of a judgment day. Of course, the government can do its share in promoting human decency. A government can do its part in promoting a just social order. The 20th century philosopher Bertrand Russell said that if governments can provide greater economic security for people, human beings will be kinder towards each other. Russell believed that much unkindness that people display towards other people stems from the economic insecurity. Voltaire claimed that if we are going to get human beings to behave better towards one another, it's very important that we have wiser customs and saner laws. Again, wiser customs and saner laws. Quick example of what Voltaire was talking about. In Shakespeare's England, the Catholic religion was banned. Everybody had to be a Protestant. Everybody had to go to church on Sunday. Indeed, during Shakespeare's life, if you didn't go to church on Sunday, you had to pay a fine for not going to church. And the Catholic religion was suppressed. Well, what did this lead to? It led to neighbors turning in neighbors. Some Protestants claiming their neighbors were practicing Catholicism secretly. And it led to a lot of religious intolerance. Well, eventually England changed the law. It no longer banned Catholicism. And today in England, the laws are such that the English government promotes religious toleration. And I think I'm accurate in saying, as a result of religious toleration in England today, people treat each other much better than they used to when the laws promoted religious intolerance. Other laws in American history that have promoted better behavior among human beings. We abolished slavery. The United States government abolished legal segregation. And I think it's fair to say that since our government abolished legal segregation in the 1960s, that the way in which many white people treat black people has improved dramatically. That's not to say that racism on both sides may still exist in America, but the fact that our laws have been improved, the fact we may have saner laws, saner, wiser laws, and customs when it comes to race, I think has been responsible in part for a better social climate. If society is going to attempt to get people to behave better towards one another, perhaps it's going to have to think more deeply about the concept of macho men. What's the usual standard by which we determine if a man is macho? Well, I think it's appearance and athleticism. Well, how about using this standard? Integrity and a good heart. I find it interesting that the men I regard as macho, at least among historical figures, many of the men I regard as macho were not very physically imposing. Gandhi was about 5'5". Martin Luther King Jr. was 5'7". Voltaire, 5'3". Bertrand Russell, about 5'5". But Gandhi, King Jr., Voltaire, Russell, among the bravest people, I think, who have ever lived, all of whom worked to create a more just social order, and all of whom were opposed by vicious enemies. Indeed, Gandhi and King were killed. The famous philosopher of antiquity, Aristippus, put it this way: the most impressive spectacle in life is the sight of a virtuous person pursuing his course in the midst of vicious people. By the way, how does the courage, so-called courage, of macho athletes and movie stars compare with the courage of a Gandhi, a King Jr., a Voltaire, a Bertrand Russell? And how do the accomplishments of macho athletes and macho movie stars compare with, again, the accomplishments of Gandhi, King, Voltaire, and Russell? Do our religions and schools do enough to stimulate people's thinking, not only about the word macho, but also about the word beautiful? Let's focus in on women for a second. Imagine a world in which a woman's moral beauty is respected far more than her physical beauty. Shouldn't the traditional kind of Miss America contest we have had in this country be a source of embarrassment? Shouldn't Miss America be more a Mother Teresa type than a glamorous, sexy woman? Indeed, shouldn't America's Miss America be a Mother Teresa type, even if her breasts and butt don't look particularly good in a bathing suit? Let me bring this to a close now. Again, this is my last segment on human nature. I think it's fair to say that every day, all of us come into contact with some unpleasant people, happiness stealers, as I would label them. Well, what can we do to protect ourselves? What can we do to protect ourselves from the major league happiness stealers most of us encounter every day? Well, first of all, I think we must learn to be assertive. We must learn to be assertive at times with dishonorable, unkind people. Also, we must do what the Buddhists recommend, and that is engage in right association. We must be very selective about the people we hang out with, because the people we associate have a profound effect on us. Also, I think if we are going to protect ourselves from other people, especially vicious people, it's very important that we become self-reliant. It's very important that we learn to enjoy our own company. Lovers of solitude have a freedom those who hate solitude do not have. Indeed, the Buddha said, it's better to travel on alone than with a fool for company. And of course, if we are going to try to be more virtuous people, it might be important that we avoid certain occupations. Also, it's important that we not use the evil in the world as an excuse for ourselves to engage in evil deeds. Indeed, Aristotle said, if you wish to be friends with yourself, be a just person. The idea is each of us should be a beacon of light, truth, affection, and love. Again, each of us should be a beacon of love, truth, affection, and love. Finally, if we are going to protect ourselves from so many of the unkind people we come into daily contact with, I think it's very important that we have a sense of humor. And the writer E.T. Gurney addressed himself to this idea of how important it is to have a sense of humor. He wrote this, again, E.T. Gurney. People are unreasonable, illogical, self-centered. Love them anyway. If you are successful, you will win false friends and real enemies. Try to be successful anyway. Honesty and frankness will make you vulnerable. Be honest and frank anyway. People favor the underdog, but they chum up to the top dog. Fight for the underdog anyway. What you spend years building can be destroyed overnight. Build anyway. Give the world the best you have, and chances are you will get kicked in the teeth. Give it anyway. Oscar Wilde, on a more serious note, talked about what distinguished one human being from another. And the famous playwright Oscar Wilde said this: "It is love and the capacity for love that distinguishes one human being from another." And I think Immanuel Kant, very famous German philosopher, provides a fine concluding remark to my 13 segments on human nature. Philosopher Kant said this, "The just person is the noblest product of creation." The just person is the noblest product of creation. Finally, Henry David Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. In his masterpiece, Walden, Thoreau penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."